Benvenuti ancora una volta. Ich war ja vorher schon lange auf der Bühne und werde jetzt also wirklich nur ganz kurz Hallo sagen und ankündigen, was auf Sie zukommt. Freuen Sie sich, das wird sicher ziemlich interessant. Wir haben als Gast Michael Taussig, ein Anthropologe, der sehr viele Bücher geschrieben hat, in denen man sofort merkt, wie er eingetaucht ist, eben in jene Avantgarde, von der ich vorher gesprochen habe, in den Surrealismus, in Georges Bataille, in die Soziologie von Georges Bataille, in Nietzsche, in Gilles Deleuze, in alle möglichen Felder. Er ist Anthropologe, hat viele Bücher geschrieben, die leider zum Teil noch nicht auf Deutsch übersetzt sind, aber das wird sich hoffentlich nach dieser Stunde dann ändern. Unter anderem Walter Benjamins Grab oder eben Palma Africana, darüber werden Sie nachher sprechen. Ich freue mich sehr, er wird am Anfang etwas vorlesen, nur auf Englisch, denn er ist nicht nur Anthropologe und auch Philosoph, Beobachter, sondern er ist wirklich ein großer Stilist und auch wenn man dann nicht jedes Wort versteht, ich habe es vorhin gesagt, der Klang und der Rhythmus ist auch immer sehr wichtig und er wird eingeführt von Stefano Knuchel. Er ist zusammen mit Michael Albert und mir sozusagen das Dreigestirn der diesjährigen Eventi Letterari. Stefano Knuchel ist Ihnen natürlich vor allem im Tessin allen bekannt vom Radio und vom Fernsehen RSI. Er hat Filme gemacht, Hugo Pratt in Argentinien, Hugo Pratt in Afrika. Er ist aber vor allem irgendwie mein Retter auch ein bisschen gewesen für die Eröffnung. Die Idee Giuliano da Empoli kam von ihm. Ich hatte das Buch auf Französisch noch nicht gelesen und hat auch alles gegeben, dass Alessandro Jodorowsky am Sonntag zu uns kommt. Er ist offenbar schon im Zug aus Paris und reist tatsächlich an. Ich bin erleichtert und schon nur noch halb verschwitzt. Stefano Knuchel hat eine ganze Woche mit jungen, neuen Stimmen zusammen ein Seminar mit Michael Taussig veranstaltet zu diesen Themen der Anthropologie, zum Thema, wie schreibt man stilistisch in der Wissenschaft. Und ich bitte ihn und die jungen Voce Emergente nun auf die Bühne zusammen mit dem ewig jungen Michael Taussig. Vielen Dank.
Please come. Good afternoon. Please come with me on stage. Thank you very much for being here for this meeting. We'll manage to do that in English. We love mountains here, so please, yes, you can sit here, Jasmine, sorry. I'm trying to find the right position. We love mountains, and the work of Michael Taussig is really a high mountain to climb, but we'll try to make it. We're here, as Stefan said, we have a group called El Move. So we have two anthropologists here who are not only anthropologists, but they're also curating the introduction to a book of the latest book, actually, The Mastery of Non-Mastery by Michael Taussig, that is going to be published in Italian, and they curated the introduction, and they studied with Michael Taussig. So they'll be part of the conversation, and we'll understand more about also the El Move initiative. So, as Stefan said, we will start straight away with some readings from Palma Africana and Mastery of Non-Mastery, so the most recent books of Michael Taussig. The only thing I want to add is that we are very grateful that Michael Taussig accepted to come here and to mentor this beautiful group and to have this conversation with us. So just a warm welcome to Michael Taussig.
Oh, you want me to start?
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Stefano, for organizing all this and getting me here. I've never been to such a beautiful place. I want to thank my co-speakers or questioners as well, Jasmine Pisapi and Valentin Bonifacio. These two wrote the introduction to the Italian edition, which is almost in the bookstores, and I want to thank you very much for doing that. I also want to thank Enrico Milazzo for pushing the book so well. If you see me sometime, Enrico, thank you. I've never heard my name mentioned so much within 5 minutes. Michael Taussig, Michael Taussig, Michael Taussig is multiple reality. I thought I'd start with reading a tiny bit, a little bit, and then I'm going to get field some questions from the other three people on the stage. So just bear with me for a second. We're discussing two books, or we're discussing a work which over, God, so long, 50 years, which peaked in two books which have just been published in the last couple of years. And so we're going to focus on these two books, Mastery of Non-Mastery and Palma Africana. I'm going to start reading a little from Mastery of Non-Mastery. It's a book that was a theater piece that I wrote, and with a group of people in New York City put together. It went from Finland to Berlin to the Whitney in New York. It was called the Sun Theatre, and this might give you a sense of what it was about. It was a book that was trying to deal with what you all think about all the time now, which is the global warming, climate change. Those very words stick in my throat because they're so cliched, they're so ordinary, they don't seem to really express what is happening. So the Berlin Sun Theatre was advertised on the program notes. The Berlin Sun Theatre, Mastery of Non-Mastery, Mastery of Non-Mastery, is a theatre piece, not a performance, not a play, but theatre becoming ritual, impelled by the re-enchantment of the sun in our age of global meltdown. In our age of global meltdown. That's a political as well as a physical, environmental thing. You understand? They work together. The intention is to connect the human body to the passage of the sun each day as it crosses the sky of history, disappearing in sleep with flecks of ice crystals when flying. That's a good part of the genesis of this book. I'll talk about, and answer to questions, other aspects of its origin. I'm going to quote from the very end of the book. Fires had been kindled in a few places. Marvelous spectacle. Red, sometimes purple flames had crawled up the hillside in narrow ribbons. Through the dark blue of sapphire smoke, the hillside changes color like black opal under the glint of its polished surface. From the hillside in front of us, the fire went down into the valley, eating at the tall, strong grasses. Roaring like a hurricane of light and heat, it came straight towards us, the wind behind it whipping half-burned bits into the air. Birds and crickets fly past in clouds. I walked right into the flames. Marvelous. Some completely mad catastrophe, rushing straight on me with furious speed. That's an extract from the diary of Bronislaw Malinowski, a famous Polish-British anthropologist. He's describing his first couple of months in New Guinea before he gets to the Trobriand Islands. For me and for us, of course, it's the most extraordinary allegory of what the world is going through right now. Marvelous. Some completely mad catastrophe rushing straight on me with furious speed, end of quote. Walking into the fire, yes, that's for us, sure. That's how I envisage us today, us firewalkers, limping behind our fireflies, faced with the re-enchantment of the sun, re-enchantment of the sun in the age of meltdown, roaring like a hurricane of light and heat, with birds and crickets flying past. And the fieldwork, Malinowski was a pioneer of anthropological fieldwork. What if this blur of bodies in flight, these insects, these birds, these flames, these colors, what if this blur of bodies in flight becomes, along with heat and color, our ethnographic focus today? We're not studying people here. We're not studying the natives. We're studying something that seems awfully like the end of the world. What if this becomes our ethnographic focus? What if the field worker, practicing the famous participant observation, participates with the birds and the crickets flying past in colored clouds, as can happen when, in terra incognita, you write in your fieldwork diary, opening up that other fire you call yourself. That was a diary extract, right? The first thing I read. This is what happens when you take seriously all the magic the people on the islands have told you about. Soft murmuring of spells into things. Like canoe lashings to go faster and faster. Fragrant herbs to make love magic. Crushed betel nut mixed with pigment to make an intense red into one's skin. Make the skin glow. What happens if the fieldwork participates in this magic too? That's how I see this book. What happens if the fieldworker, no longer studying natives, studying oneself in relationship to this catastrophe, you participate in this same magic that Malinowski described, whispering what he said were the myths of prehistory into things as poetry in the present, when the sub-freezing temperature shot up yesterday to early spring warmth. The snow started to melt like a blowtorch was put to it, and the mist rose from the river like a shroud enveloping all that lay around. We walked in the mountain, close to sunset, with the streams running high, stripping off our clothes. At times we spooked ourselves, disappearing into the mist like the phantoms we were. Same as happens in certain sunsets when the light turns everything purple with shots of yellow and the blue raining like vapor from the far-off ridge where the sun sets. The craziest thing was that every few minutes we would walk through a pocket of hot air, and then a minute later walk through chill. And the craziest thing was that as with immersion in the mist, you sensed the mimetic pull into rampant otherness in a torrent of imminent destruction. Tornadoes were reported further south. Yesterday was one of those days of utter perfection, early fall. It seemed like we were living in glass. The world's not real, but a picture in which we held our breath. I think I'll leave it at that because we don't have that much time here today. And so now I'd like to answer some questions, and I'll maybe read a bit more later on.
Thank you, Mick. Actually, this was from Mastery of Non-Mastery. We'll have some excerpts later from Palma Africana, because when we come up with the title of this edition of Trees and War, I thought, oh, what might seem like a poetic or like a place to feel between trees and war. What is the space between trees and war? Then I said, but there is one book with the shortest description I could give of your book, Palma Africana, is of trees and war. That's the shortest explication I can give. It's about Colombia. It's about Palma Africana. Could you tell us why this book is about trees and war?
What came first, the idea of trees and war or Palma Africana?
The truth is I wanted any excuse to invite you.
I have a friend, Juan Felipe Garcia, teaches law in Bogota, and he and I have been friends for 20, 30 years, and he got a degree in anthropology as well as being a professor of law in the Universidad Javeriana. And he started doing field work in what we call the coast, meaning the Caribbean coast, maybe 200 kilometers south of the coast, in which peasant people he knew were being forced off the land by the tremendous spread of trees known as palm oil trees. But in Colombia, this is they have another name. They call it Palma Africana because the original trees came from West Africa, and now they're different sorts of trees, but the crop is palm oil. It spreads, it's a rich person's crop. It spreads all over parts of humid tropical Colombia. It's taken over all of Malaysia. It's taken over most of Indonesia, and and New Guinea. It'll take over a lot of other places because it's like a witch's brew. It's the metamorphic sublime. You can make anything out of palm oil, including diesel fuel, which is what is the European Union buys, calling it green energy, green fuel. But in those places, Malaysia, Indonesia, Colombia, Honduras, and so forth, it's actually a very violent crop. And this is what I studied with Juan Felipe Garcia. And I could go into that more, but the technique that the large landowners have is hire thugs called paramilitaries who work in coordination with the army, which sees nothing, and local police, and armies of lawyers, and the peasants, of course, are barely literate, often have to move off. So that's why it was called, that's why you thought of trees and war. It's a very specific example.
Yeah, we can really feel the violence there between nature and paramilitaries. It's a sticky situation, and when you read it, not only you describe it, but you can make it feel through your style. But more on this later. I just want Valentina, because Valentina said, if I would have to describe the anthropological approach of Michael Taussig, I really would define his relation to Colombia. So, Valentina Bonifacio from Ca' Foscari University in Venezia, what do you mean by that?
I'm trying to remember, but for me, so I first came across to the writings of Michael Taussig when I was doing my PhD at Manchester in the UK. And it was very interesting because every time I was starting to study something, people would tell me, oh, you should read this book by Michael Taussig. And by the end of my PhD, they suggested already like 5 or 6 to me. And so that's the beginning of everything. I didn't even know where he was teaching. I found him many years later in New York, and I'm really happy I finally met him. But I think what makes his writings so special to us is the fact that they are really disruptive of a certain way of doing anthropology. And it was interesting for me to discover, for example, that he was first a doctor, and then he became an anthropologist. So his first training was a very practical training, you can say, dealing with bodies and people. But at the same time, his way of writing doesn't come out as a particularly scientific or analytical writing. On the contrary, every time we try to say that we want to analyze or theorize something, Mick really gets angry with us. But I think it would be interesting for you to say how you became from a doctor to an anthropologist, just through your biography.
It's very personal, so maybe I won't go into it too much, but it had to do with the fact that when I was young, I was in hospital a lot, and I had sort of different ideas about what I'd do when I grew up in Australia, in Sydney. I got a medical degree. I worked as a doctor for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. But the Vietnam War was raging, and there's, I don't know, maybe half the people here understand the intensity of feelings at that time. It seemed like the world was, in many places, was about to go under through revolutionary ideas of the 60s. It wasn't just the Vietnam War. It was clothes, it was music, it was different ways of life. So that was a fever, if you like, that was around. The 60s were a very special decade. And in the United States, the Vietnam War came out of what we call in the United States a civil rights movement, which is basically against racism against African Americans. That was really the foundation. And the anti-war movement was middle-class students on top of that. And then all those other cultural changes that I just described. So I got caught up in that movement of those times, and we were very young and impressed by all sorts of things which we can go into later, to do with Maoism and the Cuban Revolution and so on and so forth. So that was really what took me to Colombia, along with a bunch of other students. So that's when I went to Colombia. It was to live with ex-slave people, ex-African slave people who had small farms, who were being pushed aside or selling their properties to expanding sugar plantations in a very, very, very fertile valley known as the Cauca Valley. I think you know this story. I mean, you've all heard this sort of thing 1,000 million times on television or the daily newspaper about this land injustice and agribusiness. So I don't want to sort of hammer it too much. I just register it and we can move on to something else he talked about, which was so-called theory and analysis versus storytelling, because I would see myself as an anthropologist involved in crafting stories, but also the language is so important. That's why the theater is important. I mean, you must have picked that up in the text that I read. I mean, it's sort of very, depending on your personality, you could say it was overblown, was too colorful or something, but every word is carefully chosen for a dramatic effect. So it's not analysis and it's not theory. That's all there underneath. The other thing is to describe and describe well. So I'd say that was there was that passion for that way of talking, that way of writing, which took me from the hospital to the do what I do.
Sorry, what I like here is that we're starting to make a montage and a style, I think, of your approach. So we're moving between two, on one timeline. The beginning of the timeline here is 69, if I'm not wrong, when you arrive in Colombia the first time. 2019, when Palma Africana is published, like 50 years lifespan. Long relation with Colombia. You always go back to Colombia, starting as a doctor, becoming anthropologist, developing a style of writing, teaching, passing on the other. So we're moving along this line. We're just moving along this line between these two dates and how these things evolve. So it's funny because you start mentioning the relevance of style, and I would like to involve you, Jasmine, on this. But just one thing, when I read your book, Palma Africana, I was trying to explain this to you, and I said, to me, you write like a jazz player. You know, it's full of riffs. It's the words come back. I feel like Allen Ginsberg is speaking to me in a way. And at the same time, you are describing a situation. You really give an analysis and a point of view of the situation. But the rhythm, and you mentioned at a certain point, you mentioned William Burroughs. Cut the page, free the words. Words are like animals. So that's really, for you, very important, this element.
I always love that paragraph of William Burroughs. He was being attacked in the Times Literary Supplement for Naked Lunch, and the reviewers found it very bad grammar, and it was about male homosexuality. Well, they didn't want to mention that too much, so they concentrated on the style. And Burroughs wrote a letter like about this long, and he said, yes, words are like animals. Cut the pages, cut the cages and let the words out, yeah. So what I think is, what Stefano is talking about is this book, Palma Africana, has no chapters, not one single chapter. It's just punctuated by Roman numerals. 1, 2, 3, 4, it goes up to, I don't know, maybe 110. And each time there's a Roman numeral, you change the speed, you change the content. And so it's like hopping or skipping, staccato. Yeah, so you're very right about that. I was talking to my friend Nina, who's in the hall here, that it's like a snake. I said it's a serpentine text. A serpentine text, it just... And I found it absolutely wonderful freedom to write like that and not have things crammed into a chapter structure. So you talk about something, then you go to something else. Then you go to something else. It may be related, it may be not. Probably under the surface, there's unconscious connections. I thought of it as a very liberating thing. And I wrote a book recently, it's not published yet, I haven't handed it in, called Corpse Magic, which is something that grabs me a great deal about homicide and killing people in Colombia and in the United States. And that I did in a chapter form. And I really felt like I had to do it, but I found it like I was in prison to some degree. And I wished I had been able to follow the structure that you're talking about, the serpentine.
Yeah, so Jasmine, because with Michael Taussig, you can understand now why it is exciting these days in El Move. We are talking about many things, but one central topic is what's the role of style in scientific research, field work, writing. Of course, then it's very stimulating to read your books and to hear what you say. Jasmine, you had the opportunity to study with Michael Taussig. You co-wrote the Introduction to Mastery of Non-Mastery. Jasmine Clotilde Besapia from McGill University, Montreal, Canada, By the way, happy birthday. It's your birthday. So, Jasmine, how was it to have this challenge in style, in fieldwork and writing? And
Yeah, I mean, so I came to the work of Michael Taussig. I used to be a student in literature. Can you hear me?
I think we should stop calling
Calling
me
you-
Michael
Can I
Taussig.
tell you? Okay,
All right?
Okay.
You know what my name is.
So I basically, yeah. I was a student of literature at the time, and so I had no background in anthropology, and I was studying basically the work of an Italian anthropologist, Ernesto De Martino. Some of you might know him in the room. And I was interested in approaching his work from a literary point of view, so being attentive to style and also to his use of images. And so I was very, at the time I knew very little about anthropology, but I was very critical about it, and I was very critical of its pretense to objectivity. And then as I became more and more interested, I then started reading contemporary anthropologists and fell on the work of Michael Taussig and, sorry, especially his work on mimesis. So this is mimesis and alterity is a work that really crosses boundaries very well, and that, you know, if you're a student of literature, media studies, and so on, it brings together the history of anthropology, but also a way to think about media, mediation, and form, also in style. So that's how I came to get to know his work, and then realize, okay, wow, you can do something completely, there's no pretense to objectivity, there's no pretense of thinking that anthropology is a science. Actually, the question of style and of writing is fundamental to the practice of the anthropologist, not only in the writing, but also in the thinking about fieldwork, right? So anyway, I was thinking maybe coming back to what you're saying now about mastery of non-mastery as a technique. You know, how do you see writing itself as possibly being one form of this practice of mastery?
Writing being a form,
yeah.
embodying mastery of non-mastery?
Yeah, if you could
Well,
maybe kind of unpack the concept a little bit for the, you know, for the audience, for people who don't know.
Yeah, I think mastery of non-mastery as a style, or has many styles. First thing I want to say about style and anthropology and writing is I think so much depends on where you're working. If you're working with cattle in South America, or you're working in a particular locality, 50 square kilometers, and the way the people talk, the relationships that you develop, I think that will could produce a certain type of text, a certain type of language. If you're working in the south of Italy and working on steel mill pollution, again, the style will come out of your interaction, right? It's what other people are like and what you are like meeting and midway and fusing. So I don't think one can come with a particular style and say, oh, I do it this way. You know, I'm an overarm swimmer. This other person is a breaststroker. It's not like that, right? It's much more a fusion between people and the writer. And this notion that you have one sort of style, one sort of standard style, a stamp maybe, that doesn't get it. I don't think that's what we're talking about. So mastery of non-mastery would be, first of all, a recognition and a sensitivity to the relationship between the writer and the context in time as well as out of time. So that would be one thing. Another thing would be humor, wit, wordplay, unexpected swerves, unexpected changes that can happen through old-fashioned narrative plot, unexpected things happen. Or it can be like a child's play. Suddenly you reconstruct things in a different way. Now, when Stefano talked about the jazz playing thing, the improvisation, and I got all very excited talking to you just now about the Roman numerals and no chapter. 300 pages without a chapter, just beautiful. That seems to me mastery of non-mastery, because it does not obey the master's rules, right? But you can't just disobey. I mean, that's like stupid. It's stupid in the sense that there will always be rules and restrictions. So you have to play within the mastery, and you come up with the non-mastery, and you know you will never get the final answer. You'll never get solution. It's always temporary, and you move on, and you move on, and you move on. I was very intrigued by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno's work called Dialectic of Enlightenment, which was their critique of enlightenment through their thinking about the Third Reich. And they said, well, the history of the world, small topic, history of the world is the history of domination of nature. History of domination of nature out there and nature in here. And so, confronted with the catastrophic future ahead of us, global warming, let alone what's happening in Russia and what's happening with Donald Trump and so on and so forth, another form of meltdown, you ask yourself, well, how can I or how can we oppose the domination of nature? Remember, it's not just animals or trees, it's also your own nature. How can we resist? I mean, this is a question I think everybody asks themselves every day. And so my answer was mastery of non-mastery, because I didn't think you could just turn it over and say, oh, I won't dominate anymore. I'll yield. Instead of dominating, I'll let everything go over me. That seems ridiculous. That wouldn't work at all. So I got much more intrigued with a sort of jiu-jitsu sort of idea, which is the mastery of non-mastery. And I've outlined a couple of major elements to doing that and performing that. It's a very good question.
Since we are on mastery of non-mastery, you co-wrote the introduction. I'm sure there's some element you want to jump on that specific book.
Something maybe which is about that book, but not only, like the same concept of mastery of non-mastery. Something that was very challenging following your classes was the fact that you use some concepts, but then you never give the final definition of that concept, no? For example, Mastery of Non-Mastery, the title of this book, it's there, but there is not one definition of what it means, mastery of non-mastery. And it's something you keep going to and going to. It's like a very open definition, like a magnet that collects different images, different thoughts, different descriptions. And I noticed this not only with mastery of non-mastery, but with other concepts you use, no? Bodily unconscious or mimetic excess. So there are concepts that keep coming back, but they're not concepts with a clear definition that you could write in 2 lines in a dictionary, no?
That's true.
And what was very challenging and beautiful and difficult at the same time was when I attended your classes at Columbia University, that also when you teach, you do the same. you throw an idea or a concept, and then you let the people around you to become part of it, no? You leave the definition open so that everyone can somehow contribute in a dialogue to the definition. And this idea of a continuous openness and dialogue, I think, is how you stay with people, but also how your books are constructed.
I want to say that all these three people here are all cinephiles, and they make movies. And so the other half of what Stefano was going to say, or might say, is the cinema side, to the anthropology side and the literature side. Here we're talking about literature and anthropology. Bravo. But, you know, behind, she was a cinema person 100% before she became anthropologist, and so it goes. So we might just bear in mind what are the implications of that. I'm very keen, not as a filmmaker, but as a drawer, someone who draws, and combining text and drawings together on the one page. So it's a different sort of book, and I take that from ethnographic notebooks. Ethnography is perhaps a strange word for some of you. It's just a notebook, people, just a notebook that you take with you, and you write down ideas, and you often put little drawings in the notebook along with words. And it's that combination of words and drawings which would push us a bit towards style questions and to cinema sensitivities as well. On the question of clear-cut definitions and so forth, two stories. Three stories. When I came back first time to the Upper Amazon, which is another part of Colombia where I have worked, I lived for months in a house which was a house for healing people from economic destruction, soul destruction, physical disease, and so forth, administered by what is today called a shaman, but I'll use the term that is used there because the word shaman has too many silly implications for me. So they're called curaca. And in those houses, there was so much conversation going backwards and forwards. And later on, I called them stories. But they weren't stories like the grim fairy tales with a beginning and a middle and an end and so forth. They were sort of, you'll never know what I saw today walking across the bridge. Someone says, oh yeah, and then they move on, and they move on, and they move on. They're incomplete. They're half stories, let's put it that way. And they don't have a dramatic, artistic flair and so forth. So when I came back from that, I found it very hard to talk in the university. That might be part of the problem. I wanted to put as much conversation as I could in a book about that experience. So that's one point. Another, when I was working on a very hot part of Colombia in the 2005, I started to think, well, what happens when it gets hotter and hotter? How's the human body going to adapt to that? And that was 20 years ago. And I started to think, well, you adapt to heat through sweat and changes of blood pressure and I don't know what else. And I thought, that's all unconscious. That's the bodily unconscious. Your bodily has been described as having this innate wisdom. If you don't think about it, it just reacts. For example, to temperature change, to heat, which will be stronger and stronger in our world, right? Obviously. And I started to think, well, what happens if it gets so hot that the bodily unconscious, the wisdom of the body, has to sort of penetrate consciousness? You see what I'm saying? the body works automatically, like a plane on automatic pilot, brrr, while you're thinking big thoughts. But what happens if the physical environment gets so difficult that the bodily unconscious sends out a distress signal and consciousness is pulled into the mix? Will the mind-body relationship change? And reading Nietzsche and thinking about his critiques of language and consciousness, I started to think, well, what could take its place? I mean, don't we need language and consciousness? And isn't Nietzsche one of the world's great writers? And here he is talking against, saying bad things about language and about consciousness, which he really distrusts. Yeah. So the bodily, so the problem then is, why or how do you write articulately about inarticulateness? Which is sort of what Nietzsche's advocating, but he can't get there because he's too gifted. So that's another part of the problem I think you're talking about. This relationship to unconscious process, and should we allow it to become conscious? If we do, what are the consequences for wisdom and for the human body? And so it goes. So this is an indirect answer, really, to your question. Talking about, I know this sounds like obfuscation, but I do think there's something about the wisdom of inarticulateness. I don't think I was practicing that in the classroom as you're talking about. We were just fishing for ideas, but I couldn't resist the temptation right now.
Yeah, actually, if I can add something, what we wrote in the introduction is that your book might be pointing the mastery of non-mastery at an exercise in opening up the bodily unconscious, no? More than giving an explanation of what climate change is.
Exactly.
It's more...
And not even opening up, just sliding into that domain, but not explaining. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, I like that. Thank you. It puts a positive spin on density.
Well, I think I will leave it to Jasmine, but just on that, there was sometimes reading your books, there are some lines that pop out and just with great ideas or funny ideas, and this one I found it funny, in the question who you write to, not who you write for, but who you write to. And at a certain point in Palma Africana, you said, with regards to the difficulties of ethnographic writing, an anthropologist wrote a structuralist account of some Indians in the Amazon and gave a copy of the book to his mother. The mother goes, "Oh, lovely book, darling, but what's it like to be there?" You know?
Perfect.
Yeah.
You got the story? The mum says, "It's a lovely book, sweetheart, but what was it like living there?" Well, we should all listen to our mothers.
Jasmine.
Okay, I would have a question about the process of translation of your books.
The process of
translation. Because, this is sort of what we were saying also in the introduction, is that the book was translated, this last one, by a group of young Italian anthropologists who are doing their masters, finishing their PhDs, and they were very taken by your ideas around the mastery of non-mastery, the cry of the donkey. You came to give several talks that year in Italy, and I think there was a thirst on the part of these young Italian, PhD students and so on, for this kind of thinking through what they were mainly doing research on, environmental issues in southern Italy, and that's where I did my research as well. And so that's kind of how the translation came about, through this process also of conversation, of exchange with people here in Italy and students. So I wanted to know how you feel about this process, and also given the complexity of language and your attention to the metaphoricity of language and the tricks that it plays and that you can play with language, what happens through the process of translation?
Oh, you're the translator.
I'm not the translator, but have you read your works in Spanish, and then how? Yeah, so those two.
I'm always terrified of looking at a translation because a translated book is another book. We could talk at great length, but I think I'll just leave it. I'll leave it at that. When you think how many word choices you make to translate one word, how many choices you have in front of you, and the rhythm of the language as another enormously important factor. It's such a difficult thing to do. I mean, you can weigh in here.
I'm gonna leave the translation aside. I wanted to ask you something, to talk about another expression you have, which I find very interesting, which is agribusiness writing. And it's interesting for different reasons, because it's clearly related to the kind of research you did throughout the years. So through your own fieldwork, the people you met, the presence of plantations in your work. No? Now they're even proposing to talk about plantationocene instead of Anthropocene. But when I was thinking about one of the first ethnographies about plantations, it's actually your book about devil and commodity fetishism and the plantations in Colombia. So I found it very interesting because it really resonates with me, because I have, let's say, going to South America, I probably have similar experiences. But why did you choose this expression, agribusiness writing? Why this word agribusiness in defining a certain style of writing?
I should point out the first book I wrote was in Spanish for the people I and my partner, Ana Rubo, who wrote one chapter, lived with. So I was that was very important to me. That's a very 60s thing to do. So the book was published in 1975. It was in a very straightforward language, and it was distributed, people in the schools, and now it's going to be distributed more in the schools. So I just wanted to put that in there because of the issue raised here about plantations and spread. The peasant farms were all tree farms, which is something I didn't mention when answering Stefano about trees. I was talking about oil palm trees. But my own personal experience, first experience, was with small peasant farms in a valley in Colombia. And it's an agriculture in which there is very little open field, very little. Sometimes some peasant might have an open field to grow some corn or some beans. But basically it's many high trees which provide shade for cacao, chocolate, coffee, plantains, which reproduce every 14 months and is like the potato. It's the basic subsistence crop. Oranges, mandarins, and I don't know, 4 or 5 other sorts of trees of different heights and are all covered over by huge cachimbo trees with, depending on the year, pink flowers. The trees are higgledy-piggledy, however the phrase is. They're here, they're there. There's no rows. No. Everything looks sort of random. And so you walk in a place like that, and it's three-dimensional farming. It's very shady. There's very little weed growth. If it rains a lot, the roots absorb the rain. If it doesn't rain for a long time, the moisture comes out of the earth. And no fertilizer, and originally no capital, and the labor is maybe half. Labor requirements might be less than half what was required on the agribusiness farms. So it was this multiplicity, you know the word barocco, it was a Baroque form of farming. Whereas the agribusiness was like straight rows, cut all the trees, one row, everything very uniform, very scientific, like they do in North America or in most of Western Europe. So it was that contrast which was behind my choosing that name, agribusiness. That in English we say agribusiness. I don't know what you might have here. Agroindustria in Spanish. And I started to think that a lot of the journals that I read, a lot of the books that I read in the academy, the type of language, the word choice, the rhythm, the chapters, the form, corresponded to agribusiness. I was trying to say the form of one is the same as the form of the other. Now that's a little exaggerated, but that was my feeble attempt to elevate the Baroque and in the form of these peasant farms, which is a very concrete sort of thing. So that's the answer.
Well, I'm sorry to remind ourselves that time is a thief and we're already reaching the end. So I have just a final question. I worked many years for television, so usually at the end I would put the cheesy questions, like, oh, did you enjoy the place? But in this specific moment, I would say, thinking of the mayhem you describe with palm trees in Colombia, the question is, how was it for you when you came into Ticino and to Ascona to see all the palms here?
That's a mastery of non-mastery question.
I need a degree.
I was tickled.
Well, thank you very much because you've been tickling us for years and keep tickling us, please. Thank you very much.